both now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen.
One of the things that you mentioned was lockdown. You mentioned that. And maybe a lot of the younger men who are just very inwardly focused on whatever they're doing, whatever they're involved with. As another word for that would be isolation, right? And isolation is such a dangerous place for anybody to be. And you could, can turn into, the actions or the topic that we discussed earlier when we were in the parish hall. It can lead to addiction. It can lead to a lot of different things. That isolation or that lockdown. So again, I didn't really have a question on that. Just a comment. The other thing is you said a lot of things about coming out of despair, coming out of despondency, and what I wrote down there was coming out of fear. And I think that fear in life is such a big issue, because when you look at any challenges that you have in life, if you boil it down, so more often than not, it's some type of a fear that's there, and that's what I know that I personally experienced it. And then coming into the church, it heals that, and it takes that fear away, and that faith and trust in God grows. So again, those are just some comments that I made. Does anybody have any questions, comments? Peter?
So I think this might be a good one to tag team between Father Philip and Father Hans. We talked earlier about expectations and feelings of adequacy. And we've all grown up with some relationship with a father. I'll go with my particular one, and maybe you guys can get some insight about that. So, growing up in a minister's family, you were called to ministry. And if you selected any sort of other vocational thing, you were settling for second best. So, right out of the gate, it felt like, not enough. Sorry. You are able to feel, or you tend to feel like it's not enough. Am I going to be okay? The attaboy we're all looking for as men,
Mm-hmm.
So, Father Philip, you grew up with a father in ministry as well, and I'm not sure of your background, but can you speak to overcoming some of that? I'm 55, and it's still part of my life. It will always be, right? So that chase of, am I acceptable in God's eyes? Did I fail? Or just, I want to leave it open for some of your comments.
Father Philip and I have that in common. Both of our fathers are priests.
Ask these guys.
For you too, Michael, sorry.
Oh, please.
Okay. I feel tremendously blessed to have the parents that I have. I never felt any pressure from them to pursue ministry. So there's a difference there. They encouraged me when they saw my desire to become more involved, whether it was at the chant stand, choir, serving in the altar, etc. But they ultimately said, this is your decision. There's no expectation. And that took a lot of the pressure off, because it was just there automatically. There were people in the local community who were saying, so we're going to follow in your father's footsteps. And they didn't do that in a way that was intended to cause pressure, but it did. It did. So I'll be honest, even to this day, I think my biggest opponent is probably myself, because I ask myself all the time, am I doing what God wants me to do? Am I doing what my father would want me to do? Am I living up to that expectation? But that's all me. It's not anyone doing that to me. I do that to myself. So what I've had to learn to do is to let go and be my own self, be my own person. I'm not my father. I love him dearly, as I said, but we're very different people. Our ministry styles are different. So I think the key thing for me was to learn to be my own self and separate myself, not from a calling to ministry, but to ministering in the way that God had called me to minister, and to use the gifts that he specifically gave me, which are different from the gifts that my father gave me. Does that make sense? Okay. But it's constantly a battle. Michael has some of the same feelings, but I think when your father is a pastor, and I think both of our fathers have done tremendous work in the Archdiocese. They both have been priests for probably over 30 years in both cases, both well respected. And so even if we didn't feel the pressure from them, it's kind of there just because they do cast a big shadow.
It's a little surreal sitting here next to Father Philip, because we're the next generation that really started with our fathers who knew each other as classmates in college, converting to Orthodoxy essentially around the same time together. I don't know if all of you know this, but Father Philip's father is my godfather. So Father Thomas Begley was my godfather when I was baptized as an infant into the Orthodox Church. And so I'm also a priest's son, and I can speak to the battle that you alluded to because, first of all, Father Philip is an inspiration to me because it is not easy to be a priest kid, son or daughter of a priest. It is a difficult way to be in the church as a young person because you're sharing your father with many people who call him father. When my father would come to my football game, he often would have to leave because he had to rush to a hospital for someone who was dying. And it's hard when you're young to see that you're not the priority. And that can leave a lot of damage. But when you're also immature, you don't see the big picture. When you're still a boy and more me-focused and selfish growing up, and you haven't become a man, it can honestly be a huge challenge. I can relate to the pressure to being expected to enter ministry as a child, because my parents never, just like Father Philip's parents, never put that pressure on me. I didn't ever want it when I was young because I saw what my dad had to go through. No offense. I know how hard the priest job is.
No, I think there's a definite distinction there because what you were describing is so different than my experience.
Yeah.
When I said I'm interested in going to seminary, he said, "Oh, Lord have mercy." Yeah, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing.
That's right.
They knew that this was going to be a tremendous undertaking.
That's right.
I think, Father, when you know this experience when you're ordained and the lamb is placed in your hands and they say, you are responsible for this until the second coming. I mean, what greater responsibility could there be? And I think that's what my parents were thinking was, we're joyful, but at the same time sorrowful.
Yeah.
It's quite,
and that's the soberness of the expectation. You know, the clergy is held to a higher standard. I thank the Lord that I'm not a clergyman sometimes because I don't think I would be strong enough, and I would worry constantly. It takes a special man to be a clergyman, especially these days. But the expectation was put on me from the parish. Oh, of course, he's going to become a priest, or he should become a priest. I had a deacon, believe it or not, that said, "Michael, you're going to make a great priest one day." And I said, "Father, I don't think that's my calling." The deacon said, "Michael, I'm here to tell you that it is your calling." And what pressure that was, right? And what do you say to something like that? I will say that I never thought I would be involved in ministry, but now, in the last few years, I can't think of anything I would rather do. But it's from the perspective of a layman, because the church needs strong laity, not just strong priests. You know, there's 3 pillars to the church: the laity, the clergy, and the monastics. And if we don't have a strong laity, then, we're operating on one pillar, because we don't have monasteries in this country that are Antiochian. So as it is, we only have 2 legs, so we have to make sure we are on solid ground. That pressure to become, though, a priest, in a way, it actually pushed me away. And it was more other people's expectations for me. I tell people now, it's funny, if I knew what I knew now back then, I would have become a priest. But God had a different plan for my life, and I don't regret. And I've struggled with this for a while. I struggled when I started having these epiphanies and studying and wanting to learn and to understand my faith, studying the church history. I spent 2 years intensely studying the Orthodox faith. And I struggled, and I thought I could have gone to seminary, but I'm at peace with the fact now that I didn't, because, you can make a big impact as a layperson in ministry if you are in the right leadership position. You have a different relationship with the bishop where you're not so localized to a parish. So we have to use our talents one way or another, and anyone can be involved with ministry, in partnership, of course, with the pastor of the church. I had a lot of barriers to overcome because of I would say, self-imposed stigma, because I was constantly comparing myself to my father, who was a priest, and fearful that I would be compared to my priest, or to my father, who was a priest, and not just any priest. You know, my dad and your dad both have great singing voices. That's why I never wanted to sing. I would think, I'm going to be compared to my father. There's no way I can compare.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And now I have the opportunity to be in reverse position.
Yeah.
I have a son now, and I wonder, are people in the congregation going to encourage him? If so, great.
Yeah.
But also, I don't want to put that pressure on him myself and help him to kind of walk that line and decide what he wants to do himself without pressure.
And I'm grateful, though, this is another thing I'll tell you. My parish priest is Father Paul Fuller, and I had a great conversation when he first joined our parish. And he reminded me, because I sometimes have buried resentment from my younger years about, of course, not having as much time with my father, him having to pour his whole self into serving as pastor. I have to remember how grateful I should be that my parents even came to the Orthodox Church to put me in the position to be where I am now, to teach my children about Orthodoxy. God willing, maybe with a little bit more wisdom and experience than my parents had when they first found the church. The literature that's available now, my parents didn't have access to that. Exactly. When my parents and your parents were coming to the Orthodox Church, this church wasn't here in this grand. This
place was a barn and a chicken.
That's right. It's been built up, and so what a reframing of perspective when you think of how grateful we are just to have the opportunity. And it was laid by parents who were not perfect, but did the best that they could. And that's helped to reframe things too, because I thank God every day that I have that opportunity now. I hope that answered your question. I don't know if you have anything to add, Father Hans. I know you have a different experience, but hearing us.
Yeah, I didn't have that experience at all. So, at all. My family did not even understand what I was doing and didn't have much interest in it, unfortunately. Yeah.
Can you speak to any experiences you've had with other men that you've worked with, just taking that same idea into the workplace?
In what respect? Like,
so other men in the room can maybe think about how that similar experience or just the father-son relationship of...
You mean about the father and the... Well, what I deal with, my own experience was I kind of had to figure it out as I went. And it caused me a lot of heartache and took much longer than it should have taken. But part of that was my own obstinacy too, because I just didn't trust anybody. And so I had big issue with trust because I didn't know who I could trust. And so I thought I'd have to figure out everything myself, and that doesn't work either. So, so every decision that I've made, big decision, was just filled with just a lot of horrible anguish, and not necessarily so. It didn't have to be that way, but, and there probably would have been people who could have guided me along, but I had real difficulty trusting people for different reasons, so it took a long time. And even the decision to become a priest, it was very clear to me that the Lord was leading me into this. He had led me to Orthodoxy and eventually to become a priest. None of this happened overnight. But then even the day before, this anguish, is it right, is it right? And I'm not one given to mystical visions or anything like that. I'm just not. I don't seek them out. I don't need them. But once in a while they come. And so I'm walking into the church to get ordained. I'm a nervous wreck. And St. John Chrysostom, he was just there. And he said, we all felt this way. Just go do it. And that's what happened. And I said, okay. And I just went and did it. Right? And now, part of the reason I do what I do is, this is profoundly personal here, what I'm saying, is because my childhood and my growing up was not easy. And so I recognize kind of what's happening with these, young men coming in. I recognize it right away, and I understand it, and I want to bring them into wholeness quickly, in a way. I was thinking, I experienced a lot of this. I wasn't planning on talking about this. I'm not that comfortable talking about this, but I'm going to tell you. I experienced a lot of what they have experienced and are experiencing before the time when I was young. And I knew what I was experiencing was something that most of my peers were not experiencing. So I think of myself like the Apostle Paul as one born out of due season. But I always knew that the anguish and the solitude and the loneliness would one day, there was a reason for it. That's what kind of kept me going, actually, was there's a reason for it. There's a reason for it. And there is. It's what I'm doing now, because I understand it. I really do understand it, and I really know the pain. And I think, to have a father there that like really can direct you and give you the assurance and all that, I didn't have that. And so now I do it for other guys. And that's one of the reasons why it's so joyful. It's so joyful for me to do it. And I wish I would have had it, but I didn't have it. And so things took a lot longer than they should have. Okay? Now, do I love my father? Yes, I love my father. But the irony of this is that I felt like after he passed away, the relationship kind of corrected. It kind of corrected. And there's a lot of anger that I held towards him too, right? And that anger holds you back. I mean, I've learned a lot. So the relationship I have with a lot of these guys coming in is I become their surrogate father. I become their spiritual father, but the relationship usually coalesces very, very quickly because I understand the wound, right? And I understand their pain, and I don't address the pain on an intellectual level. I address it on an emotional level. And that's where the affection, when I'm talking about the affection, is really important, because you have to show them affection. The first thing I do, and they're really surprised, I don't do this initially, I do it when it's right, but what I will do, these are young guys, I will hold their face. I just hold them. I say, you have to listen to me, gently. I say, look at me, because then I know the words will go into their heart. Otherwise, it gets lost in the processing up here, right? And if it gets lost in the processing up there, then it's lost. But I will hold them, and that touch, and they're not sure what to do with it, but they like it. They really like it. But I'm gentle, and I don't overdo it, but I'll hold them, and I'll tell them what they need to know. And sometimes it's really simple. I say, you're quality, man. You're just quality. And I really feel it from my heart, and I'll kiss them on the forehead. They've never had anybody do that to them. And that is the doorway to the healing and the opening of the lockdown. These are the guys we're getting. Okay? And they're attracted to orthodoxy because they read all the books and they will make an intellectual argument, but what they're looking for is the constancy of paternal love. That's what they're looking for. And when they have that, that's when the flourishing comes, because the wound is there most often because of the lack of any paternal affection. And lacking that, I think that's what creates the distance, and that's what creates the fear. That's what it is. And This is why I'm really pushing for brotherhood, because let there be a communion of men that openly express their love towards each other, that don't try and hide it, but they just live in it normatively, right? And these guys will just love hanging out with you, and they will be healed, and they will become strong men, and some of them will become leaders of the church in the next generation.
One other thing about fatherhood and thinking about those that have children, I talk about the fact that I have 3 children, and I'm remarried now in the Orthodox Church by the grace of God, and my children, unfortunately, because of my bad decisions, earlier on in their life, I didn't make church enough of a focus. And that doesn't mean that just because I didn't start out perfectly as a father that I can't finish strong. And this is a message that I think is important as, we're seeing young adults and young couples coming into the church right now. And on my local parish, we see a lot of young men, but there's a lot of young couples with very young children coming in. In some cases, we'll have people coming in and their kids are 8, 9, 10 years old and have never been to church before. And it takes, I think, a certain level of pastoral understanding that the kids are not going to just immediately start doing matanyas and, engaging in the liturgy. It takes time, right? I look at my own children, and the last year and a half has been transformational for them, bringing them to the fall retreat here in Franklin every year, bringing them to the winter retreat in our diocese in Atlanta, bringing them to the Parish Life Conference. They're actually begging me to go to Miami next year to the Parish Life Conference, which I thought was a big win. When just over a year ago, my oldest didn't want to have anything to do with church. And it's taken a lot of hard work and effort. It's just like with Adam and Eve in the garden after the fall. They still had the same job. It just was going to be thorns and thistles. It was going to be hard. It's going to be harder. And to do that hard work takes courage and persistence. And these are the masculine virtues we were talking about. And I'm not perfect by any means, but I also am not a coward. And when I knew that I sabotaged my kids' early experience in the church by not bringing them to church, I had more work to do, hard work to do, and I wasn't going to shy away from that. And I think a lot of the young couples that are bringing their young kids to the church can be encouraged by that, it's just because you didn't start perfectly doesn't mean that you cannot finish strong. And be the comeback story for your kids about, your dad made mistakes. I own up to my mistakes with my kids all the time, and I beg their forgiveness. Before, I would have been too proud to do that, but now, in more recent years, I'm telling them, look, I messed up when you guys were younger, but this is how important this is. And I'd rather, as you get older, now that they're all entering their teenage years, when you become an adult, it's going to be up to you if you continue to go to church. I would rather make sure you have an informed decision about what it means if you do leave the church, and at least give them an informed context for what it means to stay in the church, to grow closer to Christ, at least to the best of my ability. And even though I didn't start off my kids great in making it a focus, and I didn't bring them as much as I should have, I didn't make it a focus, doing evening prayers with them, they're the ones reminding me, Dad, we need to do evening prayers, right? And that's what success looks like, because they're holding me accountable now. And that's within grasp. For anyone, no matter how old your kids are, even with adult children, you can still set a positive example and communicate the importance. It's never too late to step up and to be a father. It just takes those masculine virtues we've been talking about, embracing them and living them out. So this turned into more of a conversation, but I wanted to share that because I just know it's never too late to get started as a family. Does anybody else have questions? Or?
I do. As we were reading through this homily by St. John Chrysostom in the very last section there, I was struck by, honor and interest. We need to show interest. But this is easier with some fellows than it is with others. It's easy to show interest in someone who is already vulnerable. When they can't speak more than a few minutes without you hearing the anxieties that they have in their life. And then you can take an interest in those and show your love for them by listening to their problems, maybe talking from your own experience how you were able to resolve those issues in your own life, and all these things that we're able to do when the vulnerability exists in another person. Now, I want to love all my brothers and sisters, but not all of them are as much of an open book. As pastors, I'm sure you have experience with people who they need a bit of encouragement, perhaps, to open up. And even you, Michael, as I'm sure a mentor that you must be to younger men in your parish. Perhaps you can all give me some advice on how I could open that book. That then we can have that like deeper relationship with one another that I think we all need to be having with our brothers.
Well, ultimately, I think it's up to the person to open the book. Using confession as an example. When I first came to St. Ignatius, a lot of people would meet with me in the office to get to know me a little bit, to talk a little bit, just casually, to feel more comfortable before we came and sat in the confession setting. I think it's important to do that just in a general way, getting together outside of church in just casual ways and just building camaraderie that way and allowing that to just kind of naturally take place. You can't force them to open up and be vulnerable to you. I've had instances in confession where people have come to me and it's basically, here's a list, right? I did this and I did this, but they're not really interested in counsel. And the frustration for me as a pastor is if they don't open up, how can I help them? How can I help them to change and really truly repent and turn their life around? For the people who actually come and want that counsel and seek that, I think we see more progress. So using the sacrament as an example, I think ultimately it's on the person, but you want to get that relationship established and you want to get them in the mode where they feel like they're comfortable with you, and you want to encourage them that this is a safe place, that you can tell me anything, that this is a setting of confidence, and I feel you can do that as an individual who's not a pastor in another setting. Say, if you want to go off to the side, if you want to have a private conversation, do. I think everybody has something that they need to share, that they need to get out. We cannot bottle up the issues of everyday life and the struggles that we have and expect that we're just going to get over them, or that we can just ignore them. Ultimately, if we're going to change, we have to address them. And so it needs to be done within the sacramental setting, but it also needs to be done outside the sacramental setting. So is that helpful? I think ultimately it's on them to do it, but you want to help them to get there.
Yeah, I was looking for something more than holding you guys' face, because it might work for Father Hans, but I don't think I'll be able to get away with doing that.
Yeah.
Never say never, though.
And sometimes you just have to be patient. Sure. Sometimes people are afraid to approach. You can sense, you can discern it. They want to approach you. They want to get to know you. But you have to wait until they're ready. And because if I were to approach them, I may signal I'm open, right? But if I were to approach them and push them, I would actually push them away. So you discern it. Some people you just wait.
Yeah, I think everybody's different, and I think that it's interesting hearing from the clergy's perspective, the sacramental, with the important sacramental perspective. We also need to be in a place where we can confess our sins one to another, and there's a lot of healing that can come in that as well. There is, of course, a need for the sacrament of confession, but to confess our sins to one another, we also have to be honest and be real with each other about who we really are. And I think if we're real, this is why a lot of times, sometimes people are shocked that I'll be so forthcoming with things that I've been through. I've been through a divorce. I've committed adultery. I'll put these things out there. And some people will sometimes wonder, well, why are you giving all of that information out there? And honestly, it's because the reaction I get is, here's somebody who's real, who's not trying to put up a front that they're perfect. I'm not perfect. And sometimes I think people will close off when they have the perception that the person that they're in the presence of is trying to talk down to them or trying to come off as better than they really are. And the idea is that we're all sinners, right? We've all sinned and we all are in need of healing. And the more forthcoming I am, the more healing I receive, because it's a constant reminder to me, I don't want to go back to how I was before. And it's that reminder that also helps me to be an open book, where I don't have secrets to try to guard after anymore. I lived my life, for most of my life, with intense inner secrets that I didn't want anyone to see, that I would close up. It's the lockdown that Father Hans is talking about. It's these deep secrets. I don't have that anymore. My life is an open book, and there's so much freedom in that. And the only time that I'll bring it up is when I think I can make a connection with somebody who is lacking that real relationship with someone that they can actually connect to, where they know that they're not in a competition for who's going to virtue signal more in this conversation. Because that's what a lot of our conversations in the world have become, is who's virtue singling more, who looks like the more virtuous person, when it's all smoke and mirrors. So the authenticity comes from just being real, accepting responsibility for the real sins that you've committed, but then also your potential to continue sinning if you do not live a life of self-control and virtue and everything the church teaches. And when I'm being honest about my past and the mistakes that I've made, I'm trying to tell people, look, it's okay. I am by no means perfect, and I'm not going to try to establish a relationship with you where I'm talking down to you. If anything, I want to learn from you so that I can continue to grow. That's, I think, the position of humility that I think Father Hans has done such a good job, and Father Philip speaking about. We have to start from a point of humility if we're ever going to be able to pour love into somebody. It comes by, I love the quote in here, and I'm going to take this with me, compete with each other to who can show each other more honor. Do you all remember, I don't know if you remember the life of St. Mary of Egypt that's read during Great Lent. Remember when St. Zosimos discovers St. Mary of Egypt, and they're constantly prostrating, and they keep on asking for each other's blessing. They're constantly trying to, no, please bless me. No, you, Father, bless me, right? That's reading the lives of the saints and the stories of the saints' lives is so helpful in these instances, because it may not look like that in your regular conversation with the average Joe that's coming off the street, but if you strive for that humility as a starting point, it's incredible the loving brotherhood that can form when you're just being real and you're accepting that you're not perfect and you're not celebrating your sin, you're just acknowledging, look, I'm a sinner too. I'm no better than you, right? And that also, in this day and age, is very easy, or it's helpful when we constantly want to point the finger, look at what that person's doing wrong. Look at that scandal. Look how horrible that scandal is, when we, really, if anyone knew our innermost secrets that sometimes we guard a little too closely, would be a huge scandal ourselves. So,
Non-judgmental.
right.
A place where they can be vulnerable. So it takes time. I agree with Father Hans. I think it takes time to build up that trust. And ultimately you have to guide them to, lead them to you. And it does help, as Michael said, I feel if we take that initial step and open up and share a little bit ourselves, that might invite them then to come forward.
Bishop Nicholas said it best. You can't force anyone. All you can do is put out a little bait and back away.
Exactly.
And allow them the space to come to you if they want to, but they have to want it. You can't force somebody.
Right.
And I think a lot of times people are trying to force people too much to align to their way of thinking. That's just what we see out there in politics, and it's just a polarized approach to living, which is not healthy. What else, guys? Any other questions? We still have some time.
Microphone.
Hi, there's two questions, but I feel like I should just only ask one of them. And I think this one probably would be the best to ask, I don't know. But, so Jesus, when he was in the garden, he received his brother Judas with open arms and received Judas's kiss, knowing who Judas was. How do we get to that point to where even if we ever experience some kind of betrayal at all, to receive it like Christ?
Well, it happened before the betrayal. Okay, so just keep that in mind. But so let's talk about betrayal. Mm-hmm. Betrayal is probably one of the most painful things to work through because it's not rational. Okay? Betrayal is an impulsive act, ultimately on the part of the betrayer. In other words, there's ostensibly some reason for it, but it's really the betrayer decides to betray for some reason that is unfathomable. And there's no reason that can justify the pain of the betrayal. So the only way you get past being betrayed is to forgive. It's the only way. So I tell people who have been betrayed that you have to forgive, because it's the only way that you can pass the pain. If you don't forgive, what will happen is you will get locked up in a matrix of anger that can last for decades. Okay?
Resentment.
Yeah, the resentment. And the resentment keeps the betrayal alive in you as if it happened yesterday, even though it happened 20, 25 years ago. So forgiveness is the only way to heal from that betrayal. So the answer to your question is, how do we get to that point of forgiveness? By striving to become like Christ. By actually, if we're ever in that situation, God forbid, to forgive. Learn how to forgive and then do it. That's the only way out. That's the only answer to your question.
I also think the story of Judas is so powerful, where Christ gives us the most extreme and most powerful example of how to love your enemies, right? Because Christ knew that Judas was going to betray him, but he still embraced him as a brother. He still gave him every chance possible to turn away from the devil. He still ultimately betrayed him, but in that example, I mean, when we read about, the Last Supper during Holy Week, it's so powerful in that, Holy Thursday, hearing about the betrayal, and that, God gives us the exact model for how we should handle enemies, that maybe they hate us for unjust cause, but to become like God, right? It's a part of theosis to love enemies. I always tell people the two most difficult concepts in true Christianity is loving your enemies and being grateful in your suffering. Christ did both, exhibited both perfectly in his passion, ascending the cross voluntarily, right, at his crucifixion, but then also being in the presence of Judas really up to the end, and never, ever giving up on him, even though he knew Judas would betray him. So how do you get to that point? For me personally, I remember the story of Judas a lot. And I keep that in the back of my mind, because there's some people that I may consider an enemy that I have to remember it's not them. They're actually enslaved to the demons who are calling the shots. And that's how you can separate the person, the action of that person, from the person themselves. They're a sinner just like me, right? So that's my laity perspective. But Father, please.
I would say, too, I remember one of the clergy symposiums that we went to probably 4 or 5 years ago, before the pandemic, the last one before the pandemic. There was a conversation about healing and focusing on the sacraments. And one of the priests got up to the microphone when it was time for Q&A, and he said, we have to talk about more than just physical healing, we have to heal relationships between individuals. And he said at one point he had an adversarial parishioner who was just coming at him with complaints constantly. And he was so frustrated and thought to himself, what am I supposed to do? And then it dawned on him, I should just pray for them. And so he said, without fail, all the time, he was putting that parishioner on the discos. Even if they weren't on that list of commemorations from the family that was offering the Prospero that day, always commemorating them. And he was of the mind that if he was praying and the other person was praying on the other end, reconciliation was possible, healing was possible. So I think praying about it yourself and asking for God to heal that situation, that relationship, is so important, so vital, and coming to that forgiveness eventually. I think tied into this too, we have a policy that was handed down to us by the Archdiocese about divorces. And it's easy for divorce to occur because of betrayal or other hurt feelings. And one of the reasons why we have a period of time when those individuals are out of communion is because that's a traumatic thing. It's a ripping apart of the family. And they need to be able to deal with that and learn to let go of the hatred and the resentment for the spouse before they can come back and receive. I mean, that's scriptural. Leave your gift at the altar and be reconciled, right? So there's a reason for these things in the church. But ultimately, prayer, asking for God's help, and time ultimately to heal those wounds and to find forgiveness. I think we're human beings, we're not robots, so you can't just flip a switch and forgive that person. It takes some time.
And I lived through that process after going through a divorce. And I can tell you all, I excommunicated myself really through my actions and was excommunicated for 2 years. So I couldn't receive the Eucharist, but I mean this when I say it. It was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. And it was easy to see now in retrospect how that is a mercy of the church. It's not a punishment. This is not a courtroom, it's a hospital. It's a prescribed, essentially, medication. Because if you approach the chalice unworthily, St. Paul says it can be into your condemnation. So it's a protection. And allowing things to get as bad as I did in my first marriage to where it ended in divorce, which is not the goal, that time was definitely needed for me to, first of all, reevaluate, man, I've probably been approaching the chalice when I shouldn't have been, and to take a step back and to realize how serious that is. It's a sacrament. The marriage is a sacrament in the Orthodox Church too. So to allow myself to realize I need to take a step back and re-educate myself about these things that I thought I knew and I didn't. If I really knew what it was, it wouldn't have ended in a divorce. So seeing it as a mercy and as a gift, really. I mean, there were times when during that time I could not approach the chalice, and yeah, I got down on myself, I felt sorry for myself, but it was really the evil one just trying to tempt me away, trying to say, oh, you're better than this. No, it was the best thing that could have happened to me. Those 2 years when I wasn't approaching the chalice guaranteed that I would never, ever approach the chalice flippantly again, because it made me realize how important it is to take it seriously and to understand, if you get into a mess, you got to clean it up. Put your household in order before you reapproach. So when you were talking about that just really, that's something I lived through, and I can speak as someone who has been excommunicated, right? That was essentially someone who excommunicated himself. There's hope. There is hope, but you need to have humility and obedience. And obedience is not a forced thing. It's not slavery. It's I want to stay away from the chalice because I know the church knows better.
I like the way you worded that too. It's not like a strict legal system. Here's the crime, here's the punishment.
No.
Here's the illness, the sin.
This is the treatment.
And for you to say that was a great period of 2 years, and that it was transformative for you.
Most important thing, yeah.
Validating, reassuring that we're doing the right things.
Yeah, and those that say, oh, now I'm outside I've been excommunicated, I'm going to leave the church. I mean, the evil one is whispering that in your ear. That's what he wants us to do. He doesn't want us to do the hard work of really reapplying, rededicating ourselves, because that's hard. That takes hard work and effort and humility and honesty and courage. It's a courageous thing. When you think you're filled with shame and embarrassment, that's the time you have really for the most healing. That's what allows you to be healed in the deepest way. Father Hans, did you have
No, I was just wondering, did we answer the question? Did you get it?
Yes, and then there's one question that arose from it as well. Your answer, Father Hans, was very helpful in the sense of forgiveness for something that had happened to someone in the past. But what about for preparing someone to be able to receive the pain of martyrdom? And this can be more general than just being betrayed. But how do we as men navigate in the reception of pain in our lives, whether it be through martyrdom, through betrayal, or through the asceticism of life? How do we receive that with joy as the saints when they were eaten by lions or things like that?
Well, what's that?
That's it.
Michael, you want to take that?
No, I'm going to punt over to Father Hans. I'm good at punting.
I mean, I think with great trepidation, it's very difficult to answer. What you're saying, how would we react to the possibility of martyrdom, is what you're asking, correct?
Well, there's that, and then there's also the experience of martyrdom, as in the pain that we receive. So let's say I'm pierced by a sword. What would prepare me leading up to that? Or whatever happens to me. I don't know what's going to happen to me.
Well, here's what I think. I think that when you're faced with something like that, it's kind of like, why do guys go into training before war? Okay, because when they're faced with war, they default to their training. They default to the training. A guy's not trained and he goes into battle, is going to be all over the place. A guy who is trained and the battle comes, he's going to default to the training. You're going to react for what you prepare for. You're going to be prepared depending on how you lived your life with Christ every single day before the threat of martyrdom was even there. Okay? That's how it is. You're going to react according to what your orientation is and the depth and level of your maturity. That's how you're going to react. So how do you prepare? Just be faithful today. Live in the present. Just live in the present. Be faithful today. Do what the Lord would have you do, and then do it tomorrow, and do it the day after that. Okay? And if martyrdom comes, you'll be able to handle it. If you're not be able to handle it, maybe God will lift that burden from you. Because I also believe that martyrdom in large part is voluntary.
I do have something to build on that is related, and I think this might help you. So you asked about martyrdom, and I'd like to take a step back from the physical fear of physical harm and maybe go back to the betrayal concept, because they're related, right? Because a lot of martyrs were betrayed. So there's a story that's been told, and I'm sure an Orthodox book has quoted this before, so I'm going to paraphrase. It's a parable, right? Okay, so an Orthodox priest was walking along a path and encountered a beggar and it was a very cold day, and the priest was wearing a cloak. And the beggar was begging for money. The priest, though, was also very cold, and this was the only cloak that he owned, but he noticed this beggar has no roof over his head, and he hesitated because he thought, this beggar is just going to sell the cloak and buy alcohol, right? And we have this thought sometimes, even when we encounter the poor that are on the street, right? So what ends up happening is this priest wrestles with his thoughts about, should I give this cloak to this man who may end up just selling it and using it for more liquor or more alcohol? He ends up deciding, I'm going to give him my cloak. He hands the beggar the cloak and walks away. Then, an hour later, he's passing by another street and sees that the beggar has a large container of alcohol. The cloak is nowhere to be seen. Okay? And then the priest is cold. He's given his cloak away, and then he's starting to feel very, very dejected and sad, depressed that he gave away his cloak, and he knew that this person wasn't going to use it for but he still had given it. Then the priest, bear with me, gets hit by a car, dies, goes and encounters Christ, and Christ is wearing the cloak. Okay, so that parable is really talking about the orientation of the heart. And so even though it could be perceived as an act of betrayal that this person that you were entrusting with something that was dear to you and you were giving because you thought he was going to use it, in the West, a lot of times we want to make sure we know where our money is going, what it's being used for, but this is a very Western concept. We want to audit everything, we want to make sure that if we're giving to a charity, they're reputable, and there's reasons for that. But, Christ said, if you're doing it to the least of these, you're also doing it to me. So, when you talk about martyrdom or just betrayal and all of these things that could potentially happen to you, you have to remember that it's all about the orientation of your heart. So what Father Hans was talking about, training, is not so much the physical, right? It's the training of your heart. So that if you can get to the point where you can give somebody a cloak and not worry about what they use it for, ultimately you're giving it to Christ. When we give our alms to the poor, when we tithe to the church, we're giving it to Christ. And when our lives end and we meet Christ, He's the one that's storing treasures up for us based on our actions, and it's really all about the heart within us. So what I see when I hear the stories of the martyrs and the joy that they have, it's because their heart has been purified, where no matter what God has called them to, even martyrdom, they can get, and I'm not saying I'm anywhere close to this, they can be in a place of joy to openly welcome that because Christ Himself was martyred.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Welcome.
So I have a comment or question in regards to the betrayal process or being wronged in some way that has really deeply hurt you. And really, you can analyze it in 100 different ways and you really didn't do anything to deserve this. You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't have any sin. But yet you still have this pain, this hurt, this resentment that's inside of you. That can be very dangerous. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, this is part of the beauty of the Orthodox Church and the sacrament of confession, that even though when you're speaking with your priest during confession, you can share that. Not that you're confessing someone else's sin, but that you can share that, and that's, getting that off of you and letting that go. Is that an aspect of confession and that process? And any comments there?
Yeah, I've got comments about that. The forgiveness for most people, myself included, is a process. Okay? Very few people, I think, can forgive on a dime. So when you have the resentments, especially if those resentments and the anger, you have the anger, are towards a way that you have been treated that was unjust, not justifiable, all right, the anger is even greater. If you've done something to deserve it, okay. When you've done nothing to deserve it, and yet you still get treated unjustly, then it's really hard. So you can confess the anger, but the confession a lot of times won't take care of it because it's deep. So what you do is every time it comes up, you say, Lord, help me to forgive. That's what you do, because in doing that, in confessing it to God privately like that, what you do is you stop yourself from throwing another log on that anger fire. Lord, help me to forgive. You won't throw a log on the fire. Instead of ruminating about it, and this was unjust, and I can't believe they did this, and why did they do this, and all that stuff. And when you do that, that fire goes out. It goes out. And then after a while, that the only thing left are embers, which means that those feelings don't pop up as frequently as they used to, and usually only in situations where the injustice still affects your life in some way. And over time, even those embers will come up, and you'll be past it. So somebody came up, and actually several people have come up to me, more than several, but they'll say this, you've all heard this: Father, I forgive, but I never forget. And my response is, when you forgive, there's no need to remember. That's how you do it. That's how it's done. What's that?
I was just going to say, I think we have to remember, too, where that anger is coming from. How dare they do that to me? Mm-hmm. There is a sense of ego, of pride there, right? So, as Father Hahn said, certainly it's asking God's help to forgive. That's something we all should do. But I think also to help ourselves is to not focus on the other person's sin, focus on our own, redirect. And remember the prayer of St. Ephrem the Syrian that we say during Great Lent: Lord, help me to see my own sins and not to judge my brother. So, injustice or not, whatever, forgive them, let's focus on ourselves. And I think that can help to distance us from the anger.
I love what both of our fathers here have said, and the only thing I can add is what's helped me, when I've been in a situation where I feel like I'm being persecuted in an unjust manner or being attacked without cause. We talk about becoming more like Christ all the time, and what happened with Christ? I mean, he was unjustly brought to his crucifixion. So this may sound like I'm oversimplifying it, but when I'm in this situation, and it actually happens more than you might think, I constantly my knee-jerk reaction, I've trained myself to immediately think, how is God using this situation to help me to become more like Christ? Because if I'm unjustly being attacked, I mean, it's not that we welcome it, but we're not surprised that that happens, because if they persecuted Christ, they're also going to persecute us, they being from the world, right? So we have to actually train ourselves to expect it. And it becomes less painful when you realize that, look, this is my opportunity to become even more like Christ. And I'm not welcoming being attacked unjustly, but he himself was. And so this is my opportunity to follow in his steps in a very literal way by taking up my cross, which includes unjust persecution. All but one of the disciples was martyred. And, they never were told they were going to have it easy. So I don't know. I think it's not a masochistic approach to life, but it's just we're so taught to seek our own comfort in this culture. And we've talked about that already, about how the culture teaches us to soothe and ease our pain by doing this drug or settling on this addiction. But really the suffering part is necessary. And if we can embrace that, again, orthodoxy is what teaches this so well. The cross, our own cross, is the means by which we will be saved, which has to involve suffering, because Christ himself went through it, so this is our chance to follow in his footsteps very literally. So I actually see that as an opportunity to further my theosis. And it's hard. That's not, I'm not saying it's easy. But honestly, that constant mindset will help you. If you can train yourself to have that first thought, how is God helping use this situation to help me to become more like Christ? If that's your first thought, you're already winning the battle instead of complaining or trying to point the finger or trying to seek revenge or trying to tear somebody down over it. Like, you've already avoided all of those just by realizing this is my mini piece of martyrdom. And if you really read the lives of the saints and the martyrs, it puts my suffering into perspective, what a lot of them had to go through. That also helps to really look at how incredible the martyr's mentality was and how little my suffering really is in comparison. God willing. We'll see how things play out. Do we still have time, Eric? What was the next time for?
What time is it here?
We have 30 more minutes.
Okay.
So we have plenty of time.
Well, if anyone else has any questions or topics for discussion, we are at your disposal.
Take a little break before Vespers.
We could do that too.
Yeah, Vespers is at 6, and it's about 8 minutes till 5 right now.
Well, we could take a break. It's up to you, Eric. It's your show.
No, that's fine. Anybody else have any other
Maybe one more question?
questions, comments? You guys have done such a good job in comprehensively answering everything. You made a comment earlier, Father Hans, about Jonathan Pageau and Jordan Peterson being two people in today's world that are pointing a lot of people toward orthodoxy, which is interesting because Jordan Peterson is not Orthodox. I agree with that. But any comments on that aspect, or why do you, Michael? I know you made some comments.
Well, I think this is my own analysis, but he's Jungian, and what draws him to Carl Jung's philosophy is the archetypes, which you could translate into permanency within the creation. And because in today's cultural climate, everything is relative, and the whole notion of creation having structure, that there's permanency to created things, is a novel concept. Okay, so that's number one. He's looking for permanency. He's looking for a comprehensible structure that permeates through all the creation, and he finds it in the Jungian archetypes. And then secondly, he's read Dostoevsky, all right, and he's read, I think he went to Dostoevsky through Solzhenitsyn. And so Dostoevsky is really the father of Solzhenitsyn revived. Do you know who Solzhenitsyn was? Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian dissident. It was eventually, he was thrown out of Russia. He wrote the Gulag's Archipelago. It was the first history of the Soviet regime written by a Russian author. and it was all clandestine, and it was leaked to the West. And it was so incendiary, so powerful, that it destroyed the Marxist intellectual establishment of Western Europe. And it laid the intellectual antecedents for the fall of the Soviet Union by Pope John Paul, Margaret Thatcher, and Ronald Reagan. And so he became such a hot property that they couldn't throw him back into the gulags, where he spent 13 years of his life, and he was exiled, and he spent most of the rest of his life, except for the end of his life, as an exile in Vermont. And he was highly respected until he spoke at Harvard University in 1976, and that was called the Harvard Address. And in that address, he warned the West that the materialism that underlaid Soviet communism was also operative in the West. And he saw, it was called a warning to the West, he saw the fragile nature of Western democracy. After he said that, he became persona non grata. And he was never quoted again. He became a nobody, although he continued publishing books. And so he was actually very influential in my coming to Orthodoxy, because he introduced this whole notion about the power of the spoken word and a word spoken in truth. One word of truth outweighs the world is one of his quotes. And he drew that because of his experience in the Soviet Union, where the whole Marxist thing required a perversion of language, something you see in George Orwell, for example, who criticized it, Aldous Huxley, who criticized it. The West saw it, especially in the 40s and the 50s, forgot it by the 80s. And yet he revived that, and it was fundamentally a spiritual insight. It was very powerful for people in the West. So where did he get it? Well, he got it from Dostoevsky, about the power of the word and the power of truth and the power of language. That language, you heard me talk about truth. There's no criterion higher than truth. That's articulated by Solzhenitsyn and Dostoevsky, but it really comes from orthodoxy, because Dostoevsky drew from the Orthodox faith. Dostoevsky is a modern-day prophet and well worth reading. Now, Jordan Peterson also ascribes to that. So he takes two things that modern culture has rejected, and he sets himself against those things, that there's permanency in the creation, that there is a form that is permanent, all right? And he sees that with the Jungian stereotypes, and there is such a thing as truth. So those two principles are coming out in his talking, in his speaking, and that really resonates with the young. It really resonates with the young, because he is repudiating the two principles of modern relativism. And modern relativism, those two principles are absolutely necessary to make them into the good consumers that the primary cultural forces want them to be. Okay? Now you have Jonathan Pageau, and Jonathan Pageau is doing the work on a cultural level that is really quite revolutionary. Because one of the things we are living through is the collapse of the Enlightenment experiment, let's call it that. The Enlightenment experiment, which posits that all knowledge can be attained through man's rational processes. Okay, that what can be known we can discover and apprehend. And the thing is, that just isn't true. It isn't true. And if you're interested in cultural history at all, it's really in this generation, post-World War II generation, that the collapse is becoming most evident. In the early 1800s, there arose a myth. It's called the myth of progress, and it's also called the idea of progress. With technological progress, there came the idea, it tied into the Enlightenment myth, that man could, in the end, by his own power, the power of his mind, know everything. That became very, very prevalent. And so what happened in the West, you had the displacement of Christianity. I would say the inversion of Christianity. And you had the rise of the three great, I call them the materialist prophets. You had Freud, who took care of the interior life. You had Darwin, who did origins and teleology, beginnings and ends, creation and whatever ends, right? And then you had Karl Marx, who spoke about man and society. These were categories within Christian culture, but through these philosophies, particular philosophies, they became inverted. And they really sparked the imagination of the intellectuals. And you see Dostoevsky in particular refuting these things and refuting these ideas, seeing them enter Russian culture, and he begins the refutation of these ideas through his novels because he saw where it was going to end. He said this will end in blood, which is exactly what happened. But in the West, there was such an embrace of these ideas and such an excitement about them that, and especially with technological prowess increasing, the symbol of that was the Eiffel Tower, because here was something that was higher than the cathedral. And it was this structure created by the ingenuity and the hand of man, and it was impressive. And people really believed in the myth of progress until World War I. Because World War I was a completely senseless war. There was no ground gained and catastrophic loss of life. England lost over half of their young men. And that started turning Europe in on itself. And then you had World War II, and World War II was just devastating. And this is my assessment, is that I think that faith in progress died on the killing fields of World War I, and with World War II, Europe reached spiritual exhaustion. And in the East, of course, you had it under the Soviet yoke, which is the result of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918, which did not end until the early 90s. I was in seminary when the Berlin Wall fell. I could not believe it was falling. Nobody expected it, but it did. And then Russia is freed basically from the Soviet yoke, but Europe continues rushing headlong into the darkness, the materialist darkness that the Russians threw off. Now fast forward 25 years later, which is our time roughly, 35 years later, you see the reemergence of orthodoxy in the East, in the Russian East, and the West descending into kind of materialist totalitarianism is what the impulse is in the West. I don't think they're going to succeed, but that's where we are, and this is getting very long, but only because I'm really interested in it. But so Jordan Peterson sees that, and he speaks to it, and I think these young guys intuitively know this, and that's why they respond. And Jonathan Pageau, because the Enlightenment experiment is a failure, and we're living in a darkness engendered by that, is recovering what the worldview, especially the Christian world pre-Enlightenment worldview was, which is namely a symbolic universe. And symbolic comes from the Greek word symbolos. It's where two realities come together. The point where two realities come together. So when you see the symbol, you see both realities. The symbol represents both realities. Symbolos. And language is the symbol that reveals the reality. The cross is a symbol. When we look upon the cross, we see more than the wood. We see what the wood represents. Now, to give you an idea of how powerful symbol really is, its opposite is diabolos. Symbolos, listen to the word, the alliteration. Symbolos, diabolos. Sim, where the two things come together. Dia, the separation of two realities. Symbolos, diabolos. The word diabolos in the English is diabolical. Truth and lie. And so Jonathan, what he's doing is he's seeing that the material world exists not for its utility, how we can use it. The real purpose of the material world, clouds, trees, nature, everything that is matter, exists to make manifest meaning. So in the Enlightenment world, the bifurcation is matter and energy. In the pre-Enlightenment world, the bifurcation is matter and meaning. Okay? Now, the meaning has energy too, because we talk about the energies of God all the time. Okay, but it's not just material energy, it's spiritual energy, which is pregnant with meaning and potent with meaning that is manifested through the architecture of the material creation, nature in particular. So nature exists to reveal the meaning. It exists to reveal meaning. Meaning requires nature in order to find expression. All right? And that's the pre-Enlightenment world, and that's the world we're going to rediscover in this cultural collapse of the Enlightenment project that we're living through right now. And this is what young people intuit because they're not invested in the collapse. Okay, they're just not invested in it like older people are. They're not, and that's one of the reasons why it resonates with them so deeply. We are on the threshold of a cultural watershed, and this is how I know that many more people, young people, but older people too, are going to start coming into the church. Because the church has the means, and I don't think we're quite aware of this yet, but the awareness is going to grow. The church has the means of actually speaking into the confusion of the present culture, but also to bring forward the healing of those damaged by it. So, I mean, this is why I talk about these things over and over and over again, because I want people to become aware of this, so when it happens, we will be ready.
Father, when you think about people saying we need to address the metaphysical questions that people have.
Pardon me?
When we hear about people needing to address, we have as a church need to address the metaphysical questions that people have
Yeah.
in this era. What's the 20-year trajectory for the church? I mean, where are we now? And based on history, where is the church in 20 years?
Where's the church in 20 years? I think it depends on how we respond to the challenge. The other churches have not responded well. I mean, Christianity is largely in a massive, gigantic collapse culturally in Europe and here. And, you know, the Protestant church certainly can't answer it. Mainstream Protestantism has collapsed. Okay, Catholicism has lost all moral authority. And in Europe, Western Europe, they're definitely in collapse, in complete moral collapse. And so, we Orthodox, are we going to be able to withstand the pressure that comes against us for standing infidelity to the tradition? If we do, there's going to be a great outpouring of creativity because there will be a great outpouring of grace. Whereas the church in 20 years, it could lead the way forward. It really could. It could become the ground of the rebuilding of culture that needs to take place that I mentioned in the beginning.
I think there's signs that those that are coming to the church now, I used the term earlier that they're the early adopters, and they tend to be the more heady type of people that are more intellectual. The fans of Jordan Peterson, the fans of Jonathan Pageau, they tend to be more well-educated. And this wave that's coming in, these early adopters, they're really ahead of the curve. And if properly received and integrated into the church, their skill set, their intelligence, their knowledge, and their ability to communicate, articulate these things that they're learning in an Orthodox context could lead to explosive growth.
Yeah,
because I think what happens after that wave is you're going to see an influx of the common man, really, as this gets articulated into a kind of more down-to-earth ground level.
I really agree with that assessment. Okay, what happens if we cower out? Okay, then we just go the way of the Episcopalians. We probably should, because we're not being faithful to the tradition. Now, there will be wars in the church. They're already starting. Okay, there will be wars between the traditionalists and the liberals.
Yeah, but I really think that this is a turning point. Every war, if you study history, has a turning point when the tide shifts. And I think it's up to us to win that turning point.
Yeah,
it's on this generation to properly integrate these people who are coming to the church, to orthodoxize their mindset, to properly bring them in so that they can be the next level of mentors and articulators. They have the gift of knowledge and speech.
Yeah.
But one of the things that is so important is that they don't just stay out and intellectualize and theologize the concepts. We have to get them plugged into the church. If they come into the church, we have to get them integrated.
Yeah, I hope I'm not talking too long or in too much detail with this stuff. I hope not.
Father Hans, I wanted to react to what you said, and thank you so much. I don't think it was too long at all.
Okay.
I think it's very well said. I think you started at the right place, too, sort of up high, if you will, Solzhenitsyn, to try to explain Jordan Peterson. And I guess it was a year or so ago, he wrote the foreword to the new version of Gulag Archipelago, the French version that came out. So he's very aware of it.
Yeah.
One thing that he's received some flack about is that in his home, he has old Soviet propaganda posters.
Oh, okay.
And he was accused of being a commie Putin stooge or something because he doesn't want to forget.
Yeah, he doesn't want to forget.
And I think you're right, too, that sort of led him to Dostoevsky. Now, here's where I'm going to pick a bit at Jordan Peterson. I think he's one of those people who knows about Dostoevsky, but hasn't looked very deeply into him.
He knows about, but has not deeply looked into it?
Right, because whenever I hear Peterson talk about Dostoevsky, he immediately goes to the Grand Inquisitor, and that's all he talks about.
He immediately goes to what?
You know, the Grand Inquisitor, Brothers Karamazov.
Oh, he doesn't talk about the other stuff?
He doesn't talk about it. You know, he spends all the time talking about it, which is true, that Dostoevsky gave an extremely fair portrait of an atheist. And he went through the problem of theodicy and gave every possible reason about why you should not believe in a God like that. But he leaves out entirely, and I think Jordan suffers from this, like almost every other critic that I've ever read. They focus on that, but they never look at the answer to it, because the answer is subtle. I had to read that book 3 or 4 times before it finally occurred to me that it's Dimitri, the dissolute brother, who has the answer to it. And you might remember when he met Father Zosima, Father Zosima did a full prostration in front of Dimitri.
That's right, yeah.
And Ivan, the supposedly good atheist, he says, how could God allow a little baby to be tortured and killed? And that's a powerful argument.
Yes, it is.
And then Dimitri has a vision much later in the book. He sees a blue, freezing, dying baby in the snow in his vision when he's on a train. He says, who will help the babe? Why won't someone help the babe? And that is what we need to do. The very small acts of charity to try to ameliorate the horrible suffering in the world. And also there's a very powerful repetitive scene between Dimitri and Gershinka, the prostitute. And she tells the story of the onion. I'm sure you know that story. Where the woman, who never did anything, but threw an onion at a beggar. That was sufficient for her salvation.
Yes.
And it goes on. There's various variations of it that I won't go into now.
Yeah.
But they are always, then Dimitri and Gershinka are always saying to each other, I gave an onion.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the reply. In fact, I wrote a paper on this and I said, the answer to the Grand Inquisitor is an onion.
Yeah. And it ties into Maximus the Confessor in that the way our heart goes is the way the cosmos goes. And don't you know that wars and tumults among you are because of the wars and tumults in your own heart, like James says?
Exactly. And that's another theme of Dostoevsky is we are all the chief of sinners. And no one has ever sinned the way we are. Every man can legitimately say that.
Yeah.
Because all of our sins are unique.
Yeah.
And they have cosmic implications.
Yes.
We would call it a butterfly effect. Dostoevsky was so tuned in to this that he could see how the effects of sin ripple out. And again, that's another answer to the Grand Inquisitor. Where does suffering come from in the world? Us.
So I got a question for you guys. What's the center of the universe? Christ. You'll know the answer. What's the center of the universe? What is the center of the universe?
Is it Christ?
Human heart. The way your heart goes is the way the universe goes. So at the very center of your heart is what? The cross. The cross. And we only encounter Christ through the cross. So I tell the guys who have been black-pilled, there's blue pill, you're in the matrix. There's red pill, you awake to what the matrix is. But some guys become black-pilled and they withdraw from life completely because they think it's all predetermined, is what they think. And I tell them, you can't be black-pilled. You want to make the world a better place? Purify your own heart and do acts of charity, because that changes the world. That changes the universe. That's how evil is defeated, ultimately.
That's how you change things from the inside out.
Yeah, you change from the inside out. So you can't be black-pilled. You cannot be black-pilled.
That's a way of saying nihilism.
What's that?
Nihilism.
Nihilism. Nihilism is just transferring the metaphysical substructure of the matrix into an anti-matrix, but you're still bound to the same enslavement.
And you end up like Nietzsche and the way he looked at things, which is we killed God, we have to create a new God in his place.
Yeah.
Because there's a line of thinking that Nietzsche and Dostoevsky were very similar. And I think that they both saw the problem of where 19th century Europe was leading towards the horror of the trenches of World War I.
Yeah.
You're exactly right.
They were contemporaries, you know.
And Nietzsche was apparently quite taken with Crime and Punishment. I think he died about the time that Brother Karamazov was coming out. But scholars think that at least Nietzsche tried to correspond with Dostoevsky, but Dostoevsky didn't want anything to do with it.
Yeah.
Because Dostoevsky saw there was a possibility of a solution to the problem.
Well, Nietzsche was the West and Dostoevsky was the East. And it was, Nietzsche was the son of a Lutheran minister. And you saw the logical extension of, I think, what Western religion had become. And so in Nietzsche's vision, it was the exaltation of man and human power, ultimately, the will to power. And in Dostoevsky, it was the warning that the abandonment of the received Christianity, orthodoxy, would foster catastrophic suffering and death, which is exactly what happened.
And that's where I think the nihilism, atheism inevitably leads, like in the end of the Brothers Karamazov. Ivan, the admirable atheist, ends up possessed by a demon. And that's, in all the discussions I've heard of the Brother Karamazov, it's always the Grand Inquisitor and how wonderful Ivan was. They never say what happened to him by the end of the book.
Yeah. So here we are. It was all, in a sense, foretold and prophesied by Dostoevsky, who, back to your question, Peterson reads, and I think people can discern, in a sense, the hope that the present morass is comprehensible, that there's a way out, and it brings them to orthodoxy. That's why they work together in that, not deliberately, but they're working together. Pajot and Jordan Peterson works in a way that makes orthodoxy visible to the world in the West.
Segue. If young adults are coming here to answer these metaphysical questions about something needs to be bigger than me, and Protestantism has just tried to marry up with culture, and they can sit in a Sunday worship service and look at a fog machine that's replaced sensing, and they look at a band playing, and they think this is not what spirituality is. In our liturgy, that takes them above and beyond what they see in a normal place. Is there anything we need to do beyond just bringing them and allowing the liturgy to unfold in their presence to see it? Or what have you both, you all...
Yeah, let these guys, because I've been doing so much talking. I don't want to dominate.
You're talking to young adults all the time that come here. So does that get tangible? Like all the things we're talking about, does that come down to a very tangible question that people are asking? And how the Divine Liturgy answers that? Or what's the practicality of people inquiring?
Simple as that.
I've
been doing too much.
So this is actually a topic that is near and dear to my heart because I'm not sure what the makeup is. Here in St. Ignatius, we did a census at our parish, and the young adult age segment is by far the largest segment in our parish, and that's not typical, at least in my experience. A lot of Orthodox churches have had a young adult, I would say, deficit over the years, especially when I was younger. And it is blowing my mind what I'm hearing these young adults saying, because when you have somebody with no faith background who has never set foot in any church, anything, or you have those Protestants that come in and you always hear that Protestants have a hard time with icons or with Mary and some of the, the things we do in the liturgies, incense, bells and smells. You hear all the, you're worried. I have this worry inside of me, really unjustly. There's no reason for it, that they're just going to run the other way. But the most shocking thing to me is that they're drawn in more because of one word that keeps coming up. It is so reverent. Okay, so you talked about the band rave environment. We have young adults coming in with young kids that are so sick of a commoditized Christianity that's just been it's been marketed to the point of exhaustion, of being some kind of a substitute for entertainment, or like a Christianized version of entertainment, this audience mentality. Father, I don't know if this has been your experience, but when young adults have come in, I'm literally, every time I see them and they've never experienced liturgy before, I'm worried that they're going to be like, this is too foreign for me. But what I've seen is exactly the opposite. They're literally blown away by the beauty and the history and the reverence. That's the number one word I keep hearing, is that after liturgy, I'll ask people, so what did you think? I know it was a lot, almost like apologizing for it to them, which I shouldn't be. They're like, no, it is so reverent. This is what I've been looking for, because nothing I've attended until today has felt reverent. And this makes sense to me spiritually. So like these young adults that are coming in, we don't have to sell them on the liturgy. They're actually drawn to it and they want to come back to it. And Father, I'm going to just hand it to you, because that was a shock to me, is that we're not having to sell them on, no, please come back and we'll explain it, what the liturgy is.
No, that's been almost exactly my experience.
Yeah.
And reverence is exactly the word I was going to use too. Keep coming back to that, because they're moving further and further away from that out there in the world. Even their churches now, the way they're structured architecturally, it's more an auditorium than it is a worship space, right? And the centerpiece is the homily, and it's about having a good preacher, that's the core, but for us it's the sacramental life. And when we're talking about sacraments, you have to talk about the physical, right? And again, symbolism, as Father Hans talked about. So to me, I feel like there's a hunger there. There's an emptiness inside them, and this takes us back, we're kind of coming full circle. We were talking about our fathers, our parents.
Yeah.
That's what drew my folks to the Orthodox Church.
Yep.
When they encountered it, they said, this is what we've always been missing. We didn't know what it was, but now we know this is it. We've encountered it.
And
I've had the experience here with, like you said, specifically young adults come to me, and they'll go to one inquirer's class, one liturgy, and they're like, Chrismate. I'm like, well,
hold on.
We got a little bit more to share with you.
But they're all in. They're
there
there.
Right away. They're like, I've found it, I know it, and they understand the process, but they're ready almost right away.
Yeah, and the experience too has been it's been rejuvenating for me too, because so COVID, I think, had a major impact on so many people, because those who were going to their Protestant church, their mega church, what have you, when it went to live streaming as the only option, they started questioning, why am I even going to church? Because it was just showing up for the sermon or for a concert, which they could just experience by streaming it. And they're like, there has to be more to church than just a concert or a sermon. And so a lot of the people who've been coming to the church, COVID and the pandemic has drastically shaken their routine up, where they started questioning, what is the point of church? What is the point of worship? What is worship supposed to look like? And in the extra time that people had, they started doing their own homework, looking up church history, finding that the Orthodox Church exists, hearing a YouTube video from Jordan Peterson or Jonathan Pajot, hearing a Lord of Spirits podcast episode. That's the reason why it's taking off. Yeah. These are stepping stones that are leading them straight to the front door of our parishes. And when they get to the parish, even this is funny, the live streams that we do at our parish, which we still do this day, and I know you all do live streams as well, we have inquirers coming in that have dropped in on the live stream to see what the worship service looks like, and that breaks down barriers, because now they want to experience it in person. They get a little taste, but it's not the fullness. And they see that there's a Eucharist. They see, sacramental life is a part of our experience. They want community. We're yearning always to be in community as it is. Live streaming isn't enough for people, but in a weird way, live streaming has now opened up this evangelism opportunity, where now when the young adults are coming in, they're like, this makes so much sense. And it just blows me away every time. I'm telling you, all we have to do to get the young adults to come and to stay is to be ourselves, to be real, and to present orthodoxy the way it's been presented to us. They want it. They are yearning for it. And really, I have to keep reminding myself, Michael, you don't have to sell anybody on it. They're already coming in the door. And just be yourself. Be real.
Yeah, that's so true, Michael.
And as soon as you do that, they want to be a part of what is, in essence, a real family of people. We're all in the body of Christ, a family together. It's that extended family that they're missing.
Orthodoxy used to be known as the best kept secret in America. You probably heard that.
Yeah, I've heard that.
One time
Yeah.
And I think that was true because we didn't have podcasts. We didn't have that much literature going back to what
there weren't many live streaming.
Their time in seminary.
That's right.
Very little available in English. Now we have texts that have been translated from Greek into English. We have patristic texts that we can share with people.
Yeah.
We have all kinds of modern-day theologians who are writing wonderful things. Seminary bookstores.
Even videos like the one we're recording right now. Like, this did not used to even be a thing.
And we've used technology to our advantage. We've created a video that was shot about a month ago for a couple of our parishioners interviewed me and said, what should we expect when we walk through the doors of our Orthodox Church? So the purpose of that video was to say, we can understand that walking through those doors can be intimidating, you can feel overwhelmed. Here are a few things to get you ready, just like you were saying about the live stream. If you can peek in and see what goes on before you come in person, it makes it easier. You feel more comfortable.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about this in the workshop tomorrow, but the idea of coming to the services, it's amazing how many young adults, they don't just come to one service a month. They want to come to as many as possible. Helping them to understand what it means to approach worship in a balanced way, to approach really their faith in a balanced way so that it's sustainable. Because a lot of people will come with a lot of zeal, and we want that to be, zeal is a good thing, but we need it to be sustainable. And we're going to talk about some ideas about approaching things in a balanced way tomorrow. It'll be the last session, so please, I hope you come back for it. A little plug for tomorrow. But what we're seeing is that if you're presenting Orthodoxy the way that it should be, it's a no-brainer. People, they don't want to leave, and they definitely want to come back. And the strength that comes from that, really, you're just grafting more and more into a healthy culture within a parish. And the more that happens, and the more you have, leaders like Father Philip here that can help direct that, the sky's the limit with what you can accomplish. And how many more missions can this parish plant? You've already planted a couple.
And we're already bursting at the seams and talking about another one.
And that's a good problem to have. So
We're running out of parking.
Yeah. It's a really interesting time, and a lot of people talk about how horrible things are in the culture. Father Hans has also said this is the Orthodox moment. This is our moment, and I use the word turning point. This could be the turning point for the Orthodox Church in this country for sure. If we do our job, and if we rise up to our calling as men and take the lead and take it seriously, really this could be the turning point of what helps to start that rebuilding of culture that we've been talking about today.
And you were talking about why people would be flocking to the Orthodox Church, and it is the reverence, but it's also the theology that is not changing. I think so many people out there feel betrayed by their churches. They've changed their views on marriage. They've changed their views on ordination.
Yes.
They want something that's stable. They want something that's safe, that has been sustained for 2,000 years, and I think that's very attractive for folks.
Yeah, one of the things, I went out to coffee with an inquirer, and he said, with all the chaos that's been happening with COVID, with the riots that happened, with the political chaos, they wanted something firm and solid to cling on to amidst all the chaos that's not changing. And that is something that I think people are gravitating towards. They want something solid that's not going to capitulate and change with the times.
I think of that image of the church as an ark in the stormy waters.
Well, and the ark is a good analogy. The church is really, it's like a ship. We're all in the ship. That's the image that's given. My father even used recently, I'd never heard this before, but my father, Father Timothy Baclig, he said that he sees the church as the eye of the hurricane in our chaotic age. Where when we go outside the doors of the church, we're back in that hurricane. But when we come in here, this is where heaven meets earth. This is where we seek our healing. This is where we can get a taste of the kingdom before our death, really. And peace. Yeah, the peace is that eye. It's that perfect center where you can seek shelter. You have at least that little moment of rest.
Absolutely. Which we all desperately need.
Yeah, these days especially. That might be a good place for us to end the panel, if that's okay with you, Eric.
It is. But it was 10 minutes till 5. I thought, there's no way. We're going to 5:30. Here we are past 5:30. So let's take a break, and then we'll be at Vespers at 6.
Sounds good.
And then dinner will be immediately afterwards in the parish hall at 7 o'clock.
Thank you all very much. Thanks for being here.
I tremble for the fearful day of judgment, but trusting the compassion of thy mercy, I shout to thee like David, have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy great mercy.